Bueno, voy a invitar a la doctora Park, si puede subir, ella nos va a hablar de uso de grandes datos en investigación en salud y en enfermería. Thank you.
So good afternoon. Thank you for your introduction. And it is a great honor and pleasure for me to speak in front of Argentinian colleagues, Brazilian colleagues, and Chilean colleagues. And I also would like to thank Danielle and Charlie for inviting me here. And today I'll be talking about use of big data in health and nursing research. Okay, so how do I move my slide? Got it. Okay. Now I got it. Yeah. But how come it's not in sync with my slide and my... All right, now I see what I'm doing. Okay, so this is the table of contents I'll be presenting next 30 minutes. Okay. All right, so up to now, we considered randomized clinical trial as a gold standard for assessing the safety and efficacy of drugs or devices. But now we need to ask, does this still hold? And unfortunately, life usually, the life does not match the ideal world of randomized controlled trial. So that's the importance of observational studies or real world evidence comes along. So real world evidence, we use real world data, so we're using data coming from electronic health record to get the real world evidence. Okay? But real world data or real world evidence becoming actionable when it is powered by big data analytics. Without big data analytics, we cannot do anything about it. So now I would like to compare the difference in study design between traditional intervention study and real-world observational study. As you can see, under traditional intervention study, the patient is being treated according to a research protocol, and we use extensive exclusion criteria to select patients. And the end point of the study is efficacy and safety over predetermined period of time. And we compare treatment against the standard of care. But under real world observational study, actually patients receive actual care in a clinical practice. And all the patients must be treated, including those who have comorbidities. The outcome is a long-term efficacy and safety data, and it is possible to compare multiple interventions with a real-world observational study. And now I have a slide comparing randomized controlled trial and the real-world evidence study, looking at strength and weakness. So if we look at strength of randomized controlled trial, it says internal validity, we use a randomization, and we use a proven study design, and it is indispensable for the authorization and of new intervention, and this will become the weakness of real-world evidence study. And if I look at the strength of a real-world study, it has a very strong external validity. It is easy to generalize. It is possible to use long-term surveillance data, and it is a time and resource efficiency. Again, this will become weakness of randomized control design. Now, let's move on to big data that we're using for real-world evidence studies. They are huge in terms of volume. Now they're saying it's going to go up to exabyte, which is the 10 to the power of 18. And big data, in-house big data comes in a very different forms. Could be structured, could be unstructured, could be text, image, all this multimedia data. And the rate of data generation is so fast. If you think about data coming from medical devices, you know how fast it is being generated. And move on to a veracity. Unfortunately, data coming from healthcare can be very uncertain because of, we have inconsistency of data, incompleteness of data. Data can be ambiguous. Data can be generated later than actual care given. It could be deceived, or sometimes we use approximate data. But we have this value, coming from this insight and knowledge extracted from the data. So these are the 5 V's of big data that we're talking about. Now I want to go over one by one. So in terms of the volume of data we are generating for our lifetime, we are generating almost 1,100 terabytes for our lifetime. And 60% of data coming from environment we're living in and the health behavior we are doing it. 30% of data coming from genomics, and 10% of clinical data, data coming from clinical data. But now most of us think that only we have a clinical data, but about 90% of data coming from different sources. Now, in terms of how fast the data is being increased, they say by next year, the amount of health data will reach 2,500 exabytes, which is 10 to the power of 18. Now, this slide displays quality issues of health big data we are using. Is it truthful, or is it deliberately deceived? Is it credible, or is it implausible? Is it objective or subjective? Is it accurate or inaccurate? Is it complete or incomplete? Is it consistent or inconsistent? So all these dimensions reduce noise and the potential errors in subsequent inferences from the data that we are using it. Now, in terms of the source of data for big data, it is so diverse. They include patient data, EHR, EMR, claims data, data coming from research, image data, data coming from devices, data coming from genomics, social media, home monitoring, mobile apps, and wearables. So how you can see how diverse it is. Now, value of health big data increases if we process this data well with the proper analytical tools, so they will become information, knowledge, and wisdom, depending on what kind of analytics we're using it. Health big data is so unique and difficult to measure compared to other big data, compared to finance data or other types of data. They are, as you heard already, from different source systems like EMR, claim data like that. In the health data, the forms, types of data is so diverse, structured versus non-structured. And the data definition could be very vary from professionals. Let's say doctors use this definition and nurses use a different definition, and physiotherapists might use totally different definition. So there is an inconsistency problem, and data can be very complex because we are dealing a very complex entity, which is a human. So think about it, data coming from this complex entity, the data warehouse could be very complex. And on top of all this, there is a government regulations, and there is a requirement from the government, which is keep changing it. So this is the typical unique characteristics of health data. Now let's move on to machine learning, which are programs that automatically learn from experience. For us to deal with this big data, somehow we need to use machine learning. Okay? First type of machine learning is a supervised learning. So why do we say supervised? Because we have outcome variables. So in addition to independent variable that we extract from different data type, we also have outcome label. So using independent feature vector and outcome label, we developing machine learning algorithm. And with the new instance, you enter feature vector to the predictive model, and you will end up having expected label, expected outcome. So this is the types of supervised learning. For classifying, they include decision trees, instance-based algorithm, Bayesian classifier, artificial neural network. So let me just explain one by one. I don't know if you have this kind of game, the Who Am I? You know, like you provide a typical characteristics of that person, and you ask the question, and then you, by answering yes or no, you end up trying to find who that person is. It's kind of a guess game. I think a decision tree is just like that. So here we have an example, perfect weather for windsurfing. So what is the characteristics of a perfect weather for windsurfing? There should be wind and there should be sunny, right? So you want to have surfing under windy and sunny day, right? So you just ask different questions depending on characteristics of the data, and you end up decision model. So here you, first question you're asking whether it's a windy or not, and then you ask whether it's a sunny or not. So you want to go to surfing when there is a wind and sun. Now with the instance-based algorithm, so we store all available cases, and the classifies new cases by matching vote of its neighbors. For here, let's say we have K neighbor here, K which is a 3, then you have a new case. By looking at 3, how would you classify? You end up classifying green rectangular, right? If we increase the K up to 7, and you have 4 red star, and actually 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2, is it 7? Is it 6? So anyway, if you increase K, your decision becomes different decision, right? So depending on the K, and you classify differently. And now we have a Bayesian inference. So with Bayesian inference, if you look at this example, you want to compute the probability of a disease given a symptom, but you don't have this. This is really difficult to have it. So what kind of information to use it to compute this? You are going to use, okay, here, the conditional probability of symptom given disease, and then the probability of disease, and with probability of that symptom. So because we can have the probability of symptom given disease from the hospital data. So you're using that data and then compute it the other way around, something that you want to have it. And then artificial neural network, I think most of you heard. So you input data, and then you will end up having output data, but somewhere between, there's so many things going on, just like our brain. Okay, so that's artificial network, neural network. And then we have this regression. We use regression to predict an event. It's a type of supervised learning. So let me just go on to next slide. So here we have linear regression, which we are using it to predict continuous outcome value. And we have another regression, which is called logistic regression. If the outcome is a binary, then we use a logistic regression. So this is a model to predict something, whether it is continuous or binary. And we have a regression trees. This is very similar to decision trees, but only difference is that instead of we having yes or no, we have continuous variable, okay? So here you want to divide in the middle and you end up two different data set, and then again this you want to somehow divide this so that you have a different a trend. So just going through this kind of dividing process, and you end up a model which predict the decision. Okay, now we have another type of machine learning, unsupervised. What do you mean by unsupervised? For unsupervised learning, we don't have outcome labels, okay? So we use for the clustering, or we use the classification. So even though we don't have an outcome label, somehow we end up learning algorithm, and then with the new cases putting in, and you extract the feature vector and then put that information into the model, and you have an expected outcome. Typical examples for unsupervised learning are clustering and association analysis. So let me look at the clustering, okay? Given a set of data points and you would like to find clusters. If you have a 1 point, you will specify the cluster which is close to something. And if it's far away, you want to classify in a different class. And by how you do that? By computing similarity, okay? So let me introduce the how to compute the similarity. Let's say we have two cases here. Okay, we have A, case B, and each has 5 different characteristics. So the way you compute the similarity, just subtract each attribute and square them, add them up, and then take a square root. Okay, this is the one of the clustering methods. Okay, it's a k-means clustering method. How you do that is that you just randomly select the center point, and then next step you compute a distance between each case and the center, okay, and then assign cluster, and you compute the centroid again, and you go through same process and again, and then classify it. Now, next one is association rule learning. We call this sometimes a basket analysis. So depending on what kind of transactions you're making, and within the transaction, what kind of items you have it, somehow you try to find the pattern, associations, correlations, or causal structure among the sets of items. And then you put these relations in terms of association. So here I have an example of shopping, grocery shopping. So each transaction, we have different items that you bought. Okay, so this person bought apple and pear, you know. And with this data, we can compute how many people bought apple. And here you could also compute whether how many people buy beer given the person bought apple, okay? And then here, another indicator which is called lift. And this is literally looking at whether buying apple and beer is independent event or a dependent event, okay? And by doing so, you compute, okay? Support, confidence, and lift. And here we have relationships between canned beer and soda and canned beer and berries and things like that. So we could use that for our data. So when you have a machine learning, we have a different way of evaluating how good that models are. One could be confusion matrix, which is looking at accuracy, precision, recall, and F1 score. And one can look at gain and lift chart. One can compute area under ROC or concordance and discordant ratio. So now I want to move on the examples we did with the patient safety event. In the morning, you heard pressure ulcer and falls from my student. And now I would like to talk about the unplanned exhibition, which is the last topic. I think you saw this slide in the morning. So what we do is that we develop prediction model. Based on this prediction model, we developed the clinical decision support model. So you heard this side this morning, and then you also heard another example on the clinical decision support system this morning. So the study subject for this unplanned exhibition is that over 5,000 ICU patients with the data on time of E-tube intubation and the time of E-tube extubation between July 2013 and June next year, so about an year. We identified 60 cases which has unplanned extubation by reviewing nursing narratives. So here we have examples, different reasons for self-extubation. So we identified those from nursing narratives. Based on that narratives, we identify whether it is belong to case group or control group. And we selected features. So we looked at every single feature documented in the clinical care flow, which end up 487. And then we looked at how often they are recorded. If it's above 90%, then we use that as our feature. So out of 487, we ended up having 23 features. We divided 23 features into two groups, depending on how often theirs is documented. So more than 3 times, less than equal to 3 times. And then we prepared data. So I think I just look at this slide instead of going up. So we divided into 3 groups of data, created three different database. Okay. So first one, we have all the variables which is measured as near as to the event. Okay. And then another data set, in addition to nearest value, we have a maximum, minimum, or mean value. And then the last data set is frequency, how often it is recorded, okay? And then we looked at the difference between 2 groups. As you can see, the age, length of stay in ICU, length of stay in hospital, Apache score were different between control and case group. And this is the analysis we did univariately. And remember, we had all the nearest value, and we have a maximum, mean, and minimum, and then how often it is recorded. So we looked at each value and looked at whether they are significant or not. So that the yellow color, is it the yellow color? It's significant in a positive way. A positive way. Blue is significant in a different direction. So we end up having 3 different models. One model, first model, we used only value measured as near as to the event. The second model, we used nearest value and recording frequency. And third model, we use the nearest value, nearest mean, maximum mean, whatever which is the most significant value, and then recording frequency. So we ended up having this kind of model. Now I'm just going to move on to the next slide. And model 3, which we used nearest value, minimum, maximum, or mean value with how often nurses are documented. That model was the best model that we could use. This is another way of showing the model 3 with the green color line is the best model. And now we are studying how effective this clinical decision support it is. Currently, actually, we've done with our pilot study, we need to analyze the data from this study. Then another study we did is we used, social media data to study how parents feel about childhood vaccination. So in our lab, we do study using EHR big data and social big data. For us to study this phenomena, we developed the ontology for childhood vaccination. So in the ontology, we have superclasses like this. So before vaccination, the child themselves, family and friends, organization, and policy, these kind of things affect childhood vaccination. And then at the moment of vaccination, it's really affecting just before vaccination intention and then the vaccination behavior, type of vaccines, and how expensive it is, how close the hospital is, and things like that. And then after vaccination, the experience patient have with the hospital or vaccine, that really affects. So we have all this ontology, which is the collection of concept and relationship between concept affecting childhood vaccination. And then we collected the social media data for 1 year from 27 different social media channels. And the way we did search data, we used this kind of keyword, and we ended up having millions of documents. And then we divided each document based on emotional word that they used. So we counted number of positive sentiment and number of negative sentiment, and then we compared within the document whether number of positive sentiment is greater than number of negative sentiment. We classify as positive document. If number of negative sentiment is more than number of positive sentiment, then we classify it as negative sentiment. If they are equal, then we classify neutral sentiment. So we have positive, negative, and or neutral sentiment. And then we did analyze by counting how often a keyword is documented. And we also compared monthly sentiment trend with a news, okay, news published. And we did logistic regression analysis and association analysis to investigate whether vaccination issues really affect sentiment toward the childhood vaccination. So I'll go fast. So parent health beliefs is documented in more than half of social media posts. So you can see what is documented the most. And then this is really looking at trend of sentiment with the news. So for example, here is one example right here. There was a measles outbreak in the US. So there was a news article about it, and people getting negative sentiment about the vaccination. So these are the typical news articles that really affected childhood vaccination. And this is the multivariate analysis of vaccination issues on the sentiment over time. So here we have issues before vaccination and issues at vaccination time and issues after vaccination. And you can see, for example, here, vaccination policy is really affecting how parents vaccinate their kids. Okay, so there are some issues affecting in a negative way or affecting in a positive way. So this data can be used by the government officials to plan vaccination policy. And this is the outcome coming from association rule. So I'm just going to talk about the first one here, right here. So if you have any comment about health belief or availability of vaccination or policy that really affect positive sentiment. And that really tells you if you see this kind of issues documented, they have 1.3 times likelihood having vaccination. So again, government officials can use this kind of data and see what they need to do to increase vaccination rate among children. This is my last slide. So I would like to close my presentation with this. In order for us to do any research using big data, you need to have data. So data. And especially if you want to do any research in nursing area, we need to have a nurse-sensitive data. Okay? And as I introduced the social media case, somehow we need to have ontology or terminology so that we have interoperability of data that we're using it. And there is a very important role we need to play as nurse informaticians or health informaticians. And for research using big data, you need to collaborate with computer scientists, statisticians, and information scientists. With that, I would like to say thank you. Thank you.